Call the meeting to order. This is the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, meeting number 43, Tuesday, March 31st. We are about to study Bill S7, which is to amend a number of acts. This is the start of our hearings on this bill. And we have with us this morning the Honourable Chris Alexander, who's the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and his colleagues. The Minister will appear for the first hour, and then the colleagues will remain. This meeting is televised. Minister, I'd like to welcome you to the Immigration Committee, and you may begin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues. I'm delighted to appear here today with my colleagues before this committee about the Bill S7, the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which has as its principal aim to ensure that no girl or woman in Canada becomes a victim of earlier forced marriage, polygamy, so-called honor-based violence, or any other form of barbaric cultural practices. And obviously, we aim to extend those protections to all Canadians. Comme vous le savez, les mesures contenues dans...
As you know, the measures in Bill S7 would amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the Civil Marriage Act, and the Criminal Code to provide more protection and support for vulnerable individuals, primarily women and girls, but men and boys as well.
Against these practices because they are wrong. But we are also leading international efforts to address them as violations of basic human rights. According to the NGO Girls Not Brides, every year, approximately 15 million girls are married before they turn 18, across dozens of countries, cultures, and religions. In fact, there are hundreds of millions of men and women around the world who are living today with the consequences of forced marriage, who faced those circumstances, were denied protection, robbed of their childhood, denied their rights to health, education, and security. They are often victims of sustained violence, including sexual assault. In the most recent speech from the throne, we recognized that millions of women and girls worldwide continue to be brutalized in these ways by violent practices, including through the inhumane practice of early and forced marriage. Our government committed to help ensure that barbaric cultural practices do not occur on Canadian soil. Le projet de loi S7 remplit.
Bill S7 follows up on our government's commitment in the throne speech. It sends a clear message to anyone coming to Canada and to those who are already part of Canadian society that such practices are incompatible with Canadian values and will not be tolerated here.
The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, Civil Marriage Act, Criminal Code to add further protections. These amendments would improve protection and support for vulnerable individuals, especially women and girls, in a number of specific ways. First, they would render permanent and temporary residents inadmissible if they practice polygamy in Canada. Second, they would strengthen Canadian marriage laws by establishing a new minimum age, national minimum age for marriage of 16 years old, and by codifying existing legal requirements for free and enlightened consent for marriage and for ending an existing marriage prior to entering another. They would criminalize certain conduct related to underage and forced marriage ceremonies, including the act of removing a child from Canada for the purpose of such marriage ceremonies. They would help protect potential victims of underage or forced marriages by creating a new and specific preventative court-ordered peace bond where there are grounds to fear someone would commit an offense in this area, and they would ensure that the defense of provocation wouldn't apply in so-called honor killings and many spousal homicides. Allow me to elaborate. Mr. Chair, polygamy is an affront to Canadian values, a contradiction of our understanding of marriage. As such, it has been illegal in this country since 1890. While it's against the law in Canada to practice polygamy or to enter into a polygamous union, that's not the case in every country in the world. To increase our ability to prevent polygamy from occurring on Canadian soil and to make sure the immigration system is not facilitating this practice in any way, S7 would create a new ground of inadmissibility for practicing polygamy in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And keep in mind that these grounds of inadmissibility as codified in the Act are few. They are limited. They are important to our immigration system. They have to date related to national security concerns, threats to national security, criminality, those convicted of crimes abroad, and extreme cases of ill health, where the medical conditions that those coming to Canada are such that we simply wouldn't be able to cope in this country. Polygamy would be added to that very limited set of inadmissibilities. It would provide immigration officers with the tools they need to render both temporary and permanent residents inadmissible for practicing polygamy. The new inadmissibility would mean that those entering on a temporary basis that are in polygamous marriages abroad can only enter on their own. It also means that permanent residents found to be in polygamous marriage will be removed on that basis alone. In other words, someone who applied for immigration, received permanent residence without informing authorities of the reality of their situation, if they were found to be in polygamous unions, would be removed. We would no longer need a criminal conviction or a finding of misrepresentation in order to begin deportation proceedings. Mr. Chair, measures in Bill S7 would also amend the Civil Marriage Act in order to address the problem of early and forced marriage. This is almost certainly the part of the bill with the widest potential application, certainly from my understanding of the scale of the phenomenon we're dealing with. In Canada today, Mr. Chair, there is no national minimum age for marriage. Specific federal laws, which apply only in Quebec, set the minimum age at 16 years old. In other parts of Canada, the common law applies. There is some uncertainty about debate about the common law minimum age, which is sometimes interpreted as setting a minimum of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, although in some instances, and historically, it can be as low as 7 years old. Setting a national minimum age of 16 years old for marriage would make it clear that underage marriage is unacceptable in Canada and won't be tolerated. Other amendments proposed in S7 would codify the requirement that those getting married must give their free and enlightened consent to marry each other, and would codify the requirement for the dissolution of any previous marriage. In other words, it has not been unambiguously clear in our law today that you cannot enter another union without dissolving the previous one. Building on the proposed amendments to the Civil Marriage Act, Bill S7 also contains measures that would amend the criminal code to help prevent forced or underage marriage, en conformité avec les amendements proposés à la loi sur le mariage civil.
The bill, S7, contains measures that would amend the criminal code to help prevent forced or underage marriage.
Essentially, celebrating, aiding, or participating in a forced marriage ceremony. So, anyone knowingly officiating at an underage or forced marriage, anyone knowingly and actively participating in a wedding ceremony in which one party is marrying another against his or her will or is under 16 years old, and removing a minor from Canada for a forced or underage marriage. Other proposed amendments would create a new peace bond that would give courts the power to impose conditions on an individual when there are reasonable grounds to fear that a forced marriage or a marriage under the age of 16 will otherwise occur. Why is this important, Mr. Chair? Because in cases where family members are affected by forced or underage marriage, as we know from experience, there isn't always a willingness to bring criminal charges. A peace bond allows individuals to place restrictions on their family members by court order without having to go through the additional trying experience of pressing charges against an immediate family member. Such a peace bond could be used to prevent an underage or forced marriage, for example, by requiring the surrender of a passport, as well as preventing a child from being taken out of Canada. This is an important option for a young girl, for example, that wants to stop her family from taking her out of the country for a forced marriage, but does not want to press charges. Mr. Chair, measures in the bill would also address so-called honor killings. So-called honor-based violence is usually perpetrated against family members, usually women and girls who are perceived to have brought shame or dishonor to the family. Honor killings are usually premeditated and committed with some degree of approval and sometimes participation of family or community members. However, in some cases, they may also be alleged to be spontaneous killings in response to behavior by the victim that is perceived to be disrespectful, insulting, or harmful to a family's reputation. Under the criminal code, anyone charged with and found to have actually committed murder can raise the defense of provocation in seeking a reduction to the lesser charge of manslaughter. In other words, the accused can argue that the victim's conduct in some way provoked them into the heat of passion that brought them to kill the other person in that state. Yes, disrespect and defiance could lead to a defense of provocation in a murder case, which could potentially lead to a lesser conviction. A conviction for manslaughter instead of murder carries greatly reduced stigmatization and, more importantly, wide latitude for judicial discretion in sentencing. Manslaughter carries a maximum of life in prison with no minimum sentence unless a firearm is used, whereas murder carries a mandatory life sentence with ineligibility to apply for parole for at least 10 years. And, of course, we would be tightening the measures, the penalties in some of these cases under the life means life legislation now before Parliament. This defense has been raised in several so-called honor-killing cases across Canada. Accused murderers have claimed that real or perceived marital infidelity, disrespect, defiance, or insulting behavior on the part of the victims towards their spouse, sibling, or parent provoked the killing. As a society, we need to send a clear signal that this kind of reasoning and these kinds of acts are unacceptable and will result in a severe penalty. Passage of S7 into law would send a strong message to those in Canada and those who wish to come to this country that we won't tolerate cultural practice in Canada that deprive individuals of their human rights or that lead to violence. If the committee wishes to go into further detail about any aspect of this legislation, I'm happy to address it across the board and to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Minister, and we will have some questions from members of the committee. Mr. Gliski is first.
Thank all the witnesses for coming out, especially Mr. Alexander for coming out. My first question is, I believe this bill is sending a clear message to individuals coming into this country that violent cultural practices are unacceptable in Canada. And there are critics on the opposition side, especially from southern BC, that says that this isn't necessary, that it's just a waste of time. And I was wondering, Mr. Alexander, if you or members of your department have held consultations on this bill, and can you tell us what you've heard in relation to that aspect?
Thanks very much for your question. And many of us around the table were involved in consultations in the preparation of this bill in all major urban areas of Canada and beyond. I'm particularly grateful for the work that my Parliamentary Secretary, Costa Menegakis, did in this respect. But the view across the country was uniform. This is happening in Canada, not on an enormous scale, but on a significant scale, and one that hasn't been fully documented. The few studies that we have from settlement organizations, from university researchers, give us grounds to believe that there are hundreds, even thousands of these cases occurring even over limited numbers of years, and one case is frankly too many. And so we found, women and girls especially, but all advocates on behalf of the protection of Canadians from all forms of violence, very interested in moving forward with measures of these sort. They identified very clear gaps in the criminal justice system that prevented law enforcement, that prevented prosecutors from taking action to date on the scale in the ways that we all would have liked to have seen. And on the question of cultural practices, I mean, these are practices that have been defended in families, in homes, in communities on the basis of tradition, on the basis of the sanctity of family, on the basis of culture. And those defenses will not work. Any culture of violence, any culture that justifies violence in Canada won't be acceptable to Canadians. That's what we're trying to attack in this bill.
Thank you. And I noticed at the end of your speech you talked about provocation, and I know, listening to some of the opposition say that we should leave it in there. As a former police officer, I've always looked at it, we've had premeditated murder where a person plans that murder, or versus a murder that takes place just because it happened, a set of circumstances. I've always looked at the provocation side as premeditated. This is a planned, outright act that a lot of strategy went into. And I was wondering if you can give some details of some cases that you may know of, or your department knows of. Please.
Well, your experience as a police officer is of course, the kind of experience that is vital to getting this right. And you are absolutely right. The idea that defense with reference to provocation in a case of murder where a spouse has murdered his wife is absurd in many of the cases that we've seen. I think it's repugnant to most Canadians. I mean, this bill essentially says that in a case where you are being charged, perpetrator is being charged with murder, there will be no defense that has any reference to what the victim said. That will not constitute a defense ever. There still will be a defense by provocation, but the provocation will have to involve an indictable offense punishable by up to 5 years, by a minimum of 5 years. So it has to be a violent act in and of itself. And of course, where there are no witnesses, it will be hard to prove these things, and we leave that to the justice system. But the idea that someone could defend the act of murder by saying, she said this, that, or the other thing, is absolutely absurd and will end with this bill. Some of the cases we faced, I mean, the Shafia case that ended in Kingston, Ontario, but obviously took in many communities, is the most famous recent example. It involves polygamy, it involves forced marriage, it involves murder. And there were convictions in this case. Was family honor seen to be at stake by the accused, the murderer? Yes. Was the defense by provocation used or successful? No. But it's important, I think, for all of us to ensure that it never will be used in a case such as this. And then, of course, closer to home for me, there is the case of Miss Najli in Ajax, a murder case that is still underway, but where a sponsored spouse, husband in this case, who had come very recently from Afghanistan, is accused of having murdered and is the only suspect in the case involving the murder of the sponsor. These are the kinds of cases that show us how one case of violence, especially on the ultimate scale of murder, is too many, and how we need to protect women and girls in our immigration system and in our justice system generally, even more than they are already protected under the relatively strong system we have in Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. No, go ahead.
1 minute.
All right, one more.
This will move on if you don't have anything.
No, go ahead. Move on.
Okay. Madame Blachant-Lamotte.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us today. I'd like to come back to Mr. Glinski's comments. He said the opposition thought this was a waste of time and that it was useless. The NDP believes that violence against women and children is present in Canada and that one case is one case too many, that there's a lot of work to be done in this regard. Where our opinions differ is on Bill S7 itself. I'm not sure it's the most appropriate response, and that's what I'll be asking questions about. First, could you tell me how many clauses in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act will be modified? S7 amends provisions in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act concerning admissibility to add inadmissibility for those who practice polygamy. And apart from that, the amendments concern the Civil Marriage Act and the Criminal Code. Thank you. So it's about adding 2 paragraphs to one section of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. That's what Bill S7 would change. So most amendments proposed by S7 are in fact to the Criminal Code, and they amend 7 or 8 provisions of the code itself. But in the House, we saw that you rose to speak about Bill S7, and it's the Immigration and Citizenship Committee studying S7. My question is, why study it in the framework of immigration rather than in the context of the Criminal Code? Why is it not the Justice Minister? Why isn't it the Justice Committee studying this bill, when we see that the vast majority of this bill concerns that? Excellent question. It's a real matter of teamwork. Here around the table, you have representatives from a number of departments, and it's the fruit of joint work of 4 ministers, if not 5. The Justice Minister, the Health Minister, the Status of Women Minister, the Foreign Affairs Minister, because of the international dimension, especially in terms of early and forced marriage, and the Citizenship and Immigration Minister. So we had to choose from all of the committees we deal with. And I think forced and early marriage is the aspect that would have the most potential application in Canada. And that's including the immigration aspect, even though the changes are especially to the Civil Marriage Act and the Criminal Code. Because forced and early marriage is something that's common in many countries around the world, including Canada. But the rate of forced marriage in other countries is much higher than Canada's. There are 35 million Canadians. There are 7 billion people in the world. We have to monitor this issue in our immigration programs to ensure that people don't come here with a misguided idea that it will work here. And so that people, especially girls, are not removed from Canada in order to be subjected to a forced marriage. Thank you. I understand what you're saying. You've repeated that the most important aspect of this bill is forced and early marriage. Many witnesses at the Senate complained that this bill, or the approach of this bill in general, has racist connotations, discriminatory. We see it in the title, but I think we also see it because it's you, rather than the Justice Minister, who's carrying this bill. Yes, of course there are forced marriages, many more in other countries than in Canada, but we won't be able to deal with those in other countries. We address what happens in Canada, no matter the cultural baggage or the backgrounds of these people. If there's violence against women, like forced marriage, it's not about where they're from. It's the crime they're committing and the reaction we have to that crime. In that regard, the director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic in Toronto said that the very title of the bill, Bill S7, has racist stereotypes and fuels xenophobia towards some racialized communities. That's what was said when this witness appeared before the Senate. There was also Ms. Miville Duchesne. You cited her in the House, saying that she supports some aspects of the bill. But if you really find her testimony credible, you'll also know that she criticized the title of the bill itself. She said the title needs to be changed because, in our point of view, it can lead to or encourage xenophobia. A little later on, she said that in order to have prevention, communities must be working with us and not be alienated, and that's why we need to change the name of this bill. So it's the approach of the bill in general. That also includes the title. I don't want you to stop talking about Bill S7. We're studying it right now at the Immigration Committee, but we could do something to ensure that forced marriage is not a racialized issue, but that it be treated as a crime, violence against women. That's it. Do you think that would be good after having heard all of these witnesses criticize the title of the bill? Would it be good to change the title of the bill? No. Addressing violence is not racializing anything. It is not sowing violence. It's about addressing violence and crime, which are not concentrated in one culture or another. Then why not change the title? Because we find violence to be barbaric. And we find that people from all backgrounds, from all sorts of religions, and that was recognized by the studies that were conducted to date. This violence is sometimes justified by some individuals in the name of culture, in the name of tradition, or in the name of family. And we want to say that that is unacceptable. The defense of violence based on culture is unacceptable. That culture
Thank you to the Minister and officials for being here. We support the content of the bill, but as we have discussed, we would propose the removal of the word cultural in the short form. Now, in our view, cultures don't have anything to do with this because such acts go across cultures. You have a different definition of the word. But I guess my main point is that whatever our semantic debate might be, the reality out there is that the perception in a number of communities, particularly the Muslim community, is that the use of the term cultural is an attack on their community. So whatever the merits of our debate on semantics, I would ask that you might reconsider this and consider removing the word cultural, because it would not do anything to change the contents of the bill, but it would send a small signal to the Muslim community or perhaps other communities that their government is not out to get them. So it seems to me you would be sacrificing nothing in terms of content and sending a positive message. Now, I do have a second question which I'd like to put now so I don't run out of time, and this is with regards to provocation. I think if we accept the government's argument that the availability of the defense in the legislation sends a signal of tolerance for the crime, then we need to examine what signals we are sending with this amendment. I think the problem with the amendment is that if it were to pass, a number of specific criminal offenses would fall under this definition, including theft and mischief, because the criterion is a 5-year term. And so I wonder if the government might consider other options which would include only violent acts in the definition of the crime that is relevant. So my two questions then regard, one, the use of the term, or hopefully the removal of the term cultural in the short title, and a possible amendment in the area of provocation.
Well, Chair, I'm grateful for those questions, but confident of the answer. I mean, around the world, according to Girls Not Brides, there are 720 million girls and women who alive today who are married or entered the union before their 18th birthday. That's 10% of the world's population. Why do people want to come to Canada as immigrants? Why do they see life in Canada as women and girls as better than in almost every other part of the world? Why do they respect our justice system? Because they have a reasonable expectation that forced marriage, early marriage, will not happen here. And yet it still happens, as we know from several settlement agencies, as we know from academic studies. And so these protections against practices that are defended in the name of culture, not by all Canadians, not by most Canadians, by small groups of Canadians, need to be dealt with. And this bill does exactly that. There is a culture of support for forced marriage in Canada on a limited scale that needs to be eliminated. And that's what we hope to do with this bill. I'm confident that the Liberal Party will come around to the new name. A couple of years ago, their leader objected to use of the term barbaric. Now they accept that. Give them a little time, and they'll come around to the use of the word cultural. You know, it takes a while for the penny to drop on these points for the Liberal Party of Canada, apparently. On the defense of provocation, we're very confident of the amendment that's proposed here. We're saying that the only provocation that might be acceptable in a court of law is very serious violence by the victim. An indictable offense involving punishable by up to 5 years or more. I mean, those are violent offenses. Am I right?
No, they're not. Not necessarily.
What are the non-violent ones?
Well, the property-related offenses where the value of the property is over $5,000
Yes, exactly.
are also punishable by, I think, a maximum of 10 years. Extortion, though, that does involve some threatening conduct. But there are some property offenses that would still potentially be provocation.
Well, that was exactly my point. Thank you.
And this is something that we could look at. I think in reflection and analysis, we came to the conclusion that the non-violent offenses are very unlikely to be used. In fact, there is no case in which they have been used that we could record that has been put before me, and I've looked at scores of such cases. The vast majority of the cases that will now be relevant in any way to this kind of defense, which is only used infrequently, will be violent offenses.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Aspen.
Chair and Minister, thank you very much for being with us this morning and along with your officials to address such an important legislation. I think it's very important that this bill demonstrate that this government is taking action to strengthen our laws to ensure that no young girl or woman in Canada becomes a victim of early or forced marriage, polygamy, so-called honor-based violence, or any other form of harmful cultural practices. Minister, you touched upon the peace bond element. Could you please provide a little detail about the peace bond, how it would work? Would it prevent parents from traveling with their children? What time of evidence is required to establish the peace bond, and who could approach the court for a peace bond in these cases?
Thanks very much for the question. I mean, the peace bond is a measure that would allow real limitations on the scope for carrying out for a family removing a child or young girl or woman from Canada for the purposes of allowing a forced marriage or an underage marriage to take place in Canada by essentially allowing a court to set limits on the behavior of the family in question. And so it could be suspension or lack of access to a travel document. It could be an order not to travel. It could be an order to report to the court on a regular basis on certain fronts to make sure that what had been agreed and what was feared with regard to forced or early marriage didn't happen. So in other words, it allows a court to set limits on the behavior of the family, including the travel of the family, that would prevent a forced or early marriage from happening either in Canada or outside of Canada without criminal charges having to be laid. And that is the advantage, because we all know that there is a phenomenon, police officers would be particularly aware of this, of family members not wishing to or not being able to press charges against one another. A peace bond is an alternative solution that has an equally beneficial result, the prevention of an earlier forced marriage.
Okay, sir. And what type of evidence would be required to establish a peace bond?
I'll ask my colleagues to give an example of what evidence.
Thank you. As opposed to the standard of evidence in criminal matters, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, the application for a peace bond is on a civil standard of evidence, so it's a balance of probabilities, and therefore the evidence would be that it would be more likely than not that the defendant would commit an offence related to forced marriage. And on that basis, the evidence that the Crown prosecutor would bring to the court to establish that would be sufficient to have the peace bond emitted.
Okay, thank you very much. And polygamy, as we know, is already illegal in Canada, has been since the 19th century. We know that, unfortunately, this barbaric practice is still a reality in Canada despite this. How would this bill, Mr. Minister, affect permanent residents who are now practicing polygamy in
Sure.
our country?
Well, first of all, I think the point you've just made is that the long-standing criminalization of polygamy in Canada points to the fact that it has been a phenomenon in Canada for some time. And it actually, that point, which reminds us of bountiful British Columbia and some other communities across the country, is absolute proof of the fact that there is no racial or xenophobic aspect to this. Polygamy is a practice that can be found in Canada among people born here who've been here for generations, as well as among newcomers. Polygamy is legal in over 60 countries to one extent or another around the world, and there have been recorded cases of polygamy involving Christians, involving Muslims, involving Hindus. So anyone from the opposition side who says that one group or another is being targeted by this is absolutely wrong. And any cultural community in Canada that makes that claim is wrong. And we know from our consultations that most cultural communities welcome protection from polygamy, particularly women, as they welcome protection from forced and early marriage. That's why they came to Canada. Now, what does the bill do? It essentially says that instead of having to have a criminal conviction for polygamy, and we know there have been none of those since in over 100 years, there are some cases underway today, or a finding of misrepresentation, which is a very high threshold of administrative proof in our immigration system. Instead of having those meeting those very onerous thresholds, we will now simply have to have an immigration officer satisfied by the evidence before them as they examine the file that polygamy has been practiced, and that in itself will be grounds for removal, just as a finding that someone had been, after immigrating to Canada, had been convicted of murder in their home country would be grounds for removal. Or that someone had been a génocidaire in Rwanda would be grounds for removal. Polygamy will now be similar grounds. And I should add on your question of peace bonds that there are some orders that the court could give that haven't yet been mentioned. The family could be ordered to refrain from making arrangements or agreements in relation to the marriage. They could also be ordered to participate in a family violence counseling program. So there are some preventative aspects to a peace bond as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Aspen. Ms. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Minister. I have some questions in regard to the whole issue of polygamy. Now, it's very clear in the IRPA that polygamous couples are not admissible to Canada. But you're suggesting that they do manage to get here. I wonder to what degree do we have these situations in Canada? How many families in your study have managed to make it through the system?
Yeah, we do not have accurate statistics, obviously, about how many people have succeeded in misrepresenting themselves by coming to Canada as immigrants while in polygamous relationships, or who have managed to immigrate along with multiple wives. But talk to people who work in the sector, in settlement organizations. Talk to my colleagues. I myself, having been in this position for less than 2 years, traveling the country, have heard of dozens of cases that are proven. And they are of concern not only to those who have to give services to people in this situation, to the victims of polygamy, but they are also of concern to cultural communities, because the vast majority of those who immigrate to this country follow the rules, know what's illegal, refrain from polygamy, refrain from forced marriage, celebrate the protections that we have in this country. And when they see another member of their community living down the street who got away with bringing 2 or 3 wives here, one as the wife sponsored, another as the sister, it was claimed at the time, and a third as a parent, sponsored under the Parents and Grandparents Program, and there are such cases, they are scandalized that this was allowed to happen. And they would give evidence of the polygamous relationship if there was any hope of it having any consequences. Today, there has been no such hope. A criminal conviction for polygamy is a very high threshold, hard to do, hasn't been done lately. We're essentially asking those who benefit from the immigration system to help us keep polygamy out of it, and they will now be able to do so.
Right. In those situations where polygamy is discovered, is everybody deported?
Well, someone who is here as a citizen and is found to be in a polygamous relationship obviously could not be removed. Their citizenship could not be revoked. They would be facing criminal proceedings. And we hope in the wake of the prosecutions now underway in Bountiful, there will be more criminal and the attention this issue is now getting, there will be more criminal prosecutions and convictions, both of Canadians born in this country and naturalized Canadians. But a permanent resident who is found to be in a polygamous relationship by an immigration officer will now, under the changes proposed in Bill S-7, be inadmissible to Canada. And yes, they will lose their permanent residence and be asked to leave and removed if they don't leave, as would anyone else found who is found to be inadmissible to Canada after having been granted permanent resident status.
Do you have any concerns about the consequences? And in some ways, we've heard testimony that there are unintended consequences that could be very negative. For example, a polygamous relationship is discovered. What about the children of that relationship if they are born in Canada? What happens in that situation?
Yeah, we have an extremely generous immigration system. We have an immigration system that takes account of family circumstances. They would be looked at on a case-by-case basis. There are relief mechanisms that would allow individuals, women or children, to remain in Canada. Just as in cases of family violence, domestic violence, we have gone to great lengths to ensure that women who are victims of such violence, even if they have been sponsored by their spouses, are able to maintain their immigration status in Canada even as the husband loses it and is removed from Canada. And there are dozens of cases where recourse to that protection has been made in recent years since the change made by our government in that respect.
Thank you. Mr. Shorey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Minister, thank you very much for introducing such an important measures. Before I ask a couple of questions, Minister, I wanna make it clear that I represent the most diversified riding, Calgary Northeast, and of course the hardest working as well. I know, but I gotta say this. I wanna make a comment on this title when I hear that it's a racist. And first of all, I have not heard from one single constituency that the title is racist. And in my view as well, when we talk about honor killing, when we talk about this forced marriage and child marriage, I mean, this is barbaric. And when I moved to, you know that I'm an immigrant, and in my own homeland, motherland, it is well known that they had practice of child marriages and to an extent maybe forced marriages as well. And when I chose Canada, I chose for some reason. I believed that the system is better than where I was. So the question, I have a couple of questions. One is that when you thought about introducing this bill, I mean, did you have any, what information was known about the prevalence of forced and underage marriage in Canada? And second question is that, is the government of Canada, does the government of Canada provide any funding to organizations that help the victims?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And your riding is extremely diverse and a fantastic example of our diversity and our immigration system, the strength of our diversity and our immigration system. Again, as with polygamy, as with So with forced and underage marriage, we do not have definitive statistics, obviously. These are practices that families and individuals go to great lengths to disguise as something else, to pretend are not happening. But in the case of one settlement organization in Toronto, which has already been mentioned tonight, today there were over 200 cases recorded over only 2 years just in the province of Ontario, just by one settlement organization. And the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development has received 100 requests for consular assistance from Canadians related to forced marriage since 2009. So these are people who went to the trouble of requesting assistance from a government department. So it is a serious issue, and as you mentioned, it is widespread in certain parts of the world. I would draw everyone's attention to the website and the documentation put forward by Girls Not Brides. It's an important partner for Canada in the worldwide effort to stop forced marriage. And the map that they have showing child marriage by country shows it as a unfortunate phenomenon on every continent, but the highest absolute number of cases that they can document is in India, actually. I mean, given the population of India, that may not be surprising, but it's also been a public issue in that country, as it is elsewhere, rightly so, because the vast majority of women and girls in India, as everywhere else, would dearly like to avoid this fate.
I'm sure you would have noticed that in India even now there is a lot of awareness on this issue, and a lot of organizations are working. But you missed my question when I asked how much funding does the government provide to organizations.
Thank you for that. And I don't have exact information on all of the funding put forward by all departments in support to prevent forced and early marriage, to empower women and girls to speak up and speak out against the phenomenon of domestic violence and violence against women and girls. But let's just say that funding has grown significantly under our government. For example, Status of Women Canada has supported with the Public Health Agency of Canada a white ribbon campaign to develop a brief on engaging men and boys to prevent and reduce gender-based violence. There is a new website launched 2 years ago called Ending Violence Against Women by Status of Women Canada, with sections on the nature of violence, how to prevent it, and where to help. We have a number of initiatives, well-funded initiatives against cyberbullying, and the Department of Health, I would argue, has done even more, though it is, and the Department of Justice obviously has a vast agenda related to the changes we made to the criminal justice system, related to the Victims Charter, related to support for victims, all of which is relevant to the issue of violence against women and girls, including forced and early marriage.
Thank you, Mr. Leong.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your attendance at this session. I wish to we understand that from the speech indicates that Canada needs to, the government needs to strengthen this prevention of violence to women and children and so on. What I'd like you to elaborate on is that there is a very distinct difference between what we call the cultural practice and someone hiding behind religious freedom. So perhaps you can elaborate and share with us your thoughts on how we make those distinctions between someone hiding behind religious freedom versus barbaric cultural practice.
Right. Well, I think what we're saying with this bill is that these practices, which involve violence, which constitute crimes, cannot be defended under any other heading. You can't defend them because it's a family practice. You can't defend them because that's just the way things were done traditionally in my community, whether that community is Bountiful, British Columbia, or some community elsewhere in Canada, or some community abroad. You can't defend those practices in the names of culture, to say that I don't have to observe the criminal code in this case because my culture exempts me from that. And there would be no defense in terms of religious freedom either. One's religion, one's culture, does not give one the right to violate, to commit crimes in Canada, to violate the criminal code. And I think all the outstanding leaders of our cultural communities, of our religious communities, understand that the rule of law is one of the great anchors of the quality of life in this country. And we are strengthening it when we attack barbaric practices, violent practices that masquerade as culturally acceptable or even religiously acceptable practices. I mean, you remember some of the practices that were tolerated in the name of religion in previous centuries, even in the last century, in many parts of the world. They also were barbaric. I think every religion has some of those practices. And we see the Islamic State doing horrific things and justifying them in the name of Islam. We know that's not Islam. We know that's not justified by reference to religion. This is terrorism. This is criminality. This is horrific. And it shouldn't be tolerated anywhere. It certainly won't be tolerated in Canada, even in the forms it previously was, if we enact these measures.
Actually, that brings me to my point that earlier in the year, or very often in my community of Willowdale, where there's a significant diversity and multicultural people from various national origins and so on, I ask the question, why do you come here? And we come here because of our shared values in freedom, equality, democracy, and respect for the rule of law. And I think that this addresses this point precisely. Yeah.
Absolutely, but there is an almost universal issue here that really needs to be attacked. Quite apart from the issue of culture and religion, there can be a tendency when violence has taken place in a family, inside a circle of people who are related in one way or another, to say, we will just resolve this ourselves. This does not constitute a crime. It was one of us against the other. We can patch it up. We can overcome this. And unfortunately, violence against women and girls, quite apart from immigrant communities, quite apart from the phenomenon of polygamy and forced marriage, is still far too common in this country. And there are still far too many cases of sexual assault, forced marriage, early marriage, that are brought forward into the criminal justice system. We need to make sure that women and girls feel empowered to bring these issues forward, that they are not re-victimized, that they are protected, that men, boys, women, girls speak up and speak out about these issues, that they get the support they need in the community, and that we are, down the road, increasingly known as the country in the world where violence against women and girls, including these barbaric practices that we're discussing today, do not take place or take place on the very lowest level in the world. That's our goal, and it involves all of us, because every community has cases where violence of this type, as you would know, Mr. Iglinsky, has gone unpunished and uninvestigated. And we need everyone to make this their business.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Madame Blechamp-Lemos.
Merci. J'ai deux autres questions.
Thank you. I have two more questions for you. First, I'd like to quote what you said in the House of Commons during the first hours of debate on S7. We also prepared this bill based on a report from the committee during 2013 and 2014. This report was about the protection of women in our immigration programs. End of quote. I was here at the beginning of this study. I participated in writing that report. And as you probably noticed, in the supplementary report, the vast majority of witnesses, almost all of them, were not in favor of conditional permanent residency, saying it was an important factor in the vulnerability of women, and that abolishing that status, or at least changing it, would help women in situations of violence, for example, in forced marriages. If you really prepared this bill, taking into account the testimony we heard during that study and in the report of this committee, do you have the intention to bring amendments to the conditional permanent residency status or to abolish it? The question is for your opinion, but rather we'd like to know, will you plan to abolish it soon? We've already made changes to this aspect in our immigration system. We've ensured that women sponsored by men who are victims of conjugal violence, of domestic violence, of any type of violence, in fact, are able to have their permanent residency status protected, even if the sponsor is removed. As I said earlier in the session, we are encouraged by the fact that dozens of cases, if not hundreds, I know there are many dozens of cases that already exist in which women have benefited from this measure. Do you have the intention of changing it again? Is that the only change you would make? Because the testimony was based on those amendments as well. That's what they commented on. We've strengthened it since then. And the number of women who use this measure is on the increase. We're doing a lot to protect women who are sponsored. Thank you, Minister. My question is not about the other things you're doing. So I see you're not going to make any changes despite the testimony. Yes, we will, if we can have beneficial effects. So it's not on your radar currently. It's always on our radar. The protection of women. It's not very convincing, unfortunately. I don't have the impression that you've heard those witnesses. That's okay. Each one of us has our priorities. Your priority is to not support the bill. Excuse me. You talked about numbers earlier, and it's clear to everyone that we have a problem. There aren't enough people who are speaking out and reporting this through all the processes. There are measures that have been put in place in S7, but since it's been put in place about 6 years ago, the police hasn't been able to press charges against anyone, and the courts haven't found anyone guilty. There are many witnesses who have said that the measures in S7 could aggravate the situation and decrease the cases reported. What would you respond to them? What is there in S7? What changes could you suggest in S7 to address those fears and to ensure that there are more cases reported rather than fewer with S7? I think it will increase the number of cases reported. There are ways to participate in forced marriages that weren't criminalized up till now, and they will be going forward. Thank you. You think it will increase? That's against what the people on the ground are saying. If I have someone from the United Kingdom who's seen those changes and who's talked to victims and is saying that victims are often girls and young women who tell us, I want to be protected by police officers, but I don't want to go after my family. I don't want my family to go to prison. They clearly say that if they talk to police officers and they had to press charges, then they would withdraw and refuse to cooperate. We've heard what you have to say, but this is what witnesses are hearing on the ground. They're speaking to many more victims than you and I put together. So refusing to hear those concerns is bad faith.
I'm sorry, unless you can very quickly finish. We've run out of time. Mr. Minister, I want to thank you for taking the time and starting us off on studying this bill, and we appreciate your comments. Thank you for coming. We will suspend. We will suspend.
Thanks, you guys.
We will reconvene. For the second hour, we have representatives from two departments, from the Department of Justice and the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. I'd like to welcome Jillian Blackwell, who is a Senior Counsel of the Family, Children and Youth Sector. Good morning to you. Joanne Kleinberg, Senior Counsel of the Criminal Law Policy Section, and Lisa Hitch, who is the Senior Counsel, Family, Children and Youth Sector. Good morning to you. And from the Citizenship and Immigration, we have Maureen Say, who is the Director of Admissibility Branch. We have Karen Clark, who is the Deputy Director of Admissibility Branch, and Paul Urich, who will be joining us soon, who is the legal counsel. I think we've heard from the minister, so there may be some technical questions that my colleagues have. Mr. Eglinski.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here. Throughout my years on the force within the RCMP, I spent a lot of time in remote communities. And I was not surprised. I was surprised at the time when I was doing the investigation to find out that there was no age in Canada. And I found in a number of cases where we had complaints levied of young people being asked or getting involved in a marriage at the age sometimes at 14 or 15. And I'll go back, I believe it's more of a cultural practice, and I'm talking about very remote communities within Canada, isolated communities within Canada where they really haven't progressed at the rate that the rest of them have. They're very happy with the lifestyle that they live, very remote lifestyle, living off the land. And their grandparents probably got married at the age of 14 and 15, and maybe their parents did, and maybe they find that's acceptable. But I think that as the youth of today in Canada and across this country having more access to the computer internet system, we definitely need an age bracket put in the Act. And I wonder if I could ask Joanne if she would just clarify the real meaning behind this, the change in the Civil Marriage Act that will come because of Bill C-7 and the requirement for that age factor to be in there.
I will actually defer that particular question to my colleague,
Lisa.
Thank you very much. There is, as you point out, currently no national minimum age for marriage. This is an area which is very confusing to many people because they assume, as you point out, that there is one. The province of Quebec is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has an actual minimum age for marriage in legislation. It's in federal legislation. The Federal Civil Law Harmonization Act number 1 provides age 16 as the minimum age for marriage. In other jurisdictions in Canada, what happens is that there are many ages for marriage. The provinces will provide the age of majority is the age for independent consent. And below the age of majority, say, for example, from 19 to 16 in some jurisdictions, or from 18 to 16, one can get married with parental consent. Where parental consent is not available, there are court orders that are available. In many jurisdictions, they then go further and provide that under 16 there are further requirements. For example, court order, or in some jurisdictions, proof of pregnancy of the female, as it says in legislation, or proof that the girl child is a mother of a live child before the marriage can take place. What is a little bit worrisome is that if you look even further in most of the statutes, provincial statutes, there's another provision that says that even if the children marry under that age, the marriage cannot be invalidated if the marriage has been consummated, or if there was intercourse before the marriage, or if the pair have lived together as husband and wife after the marriage. So even if it's under those ages, it can't be invalidated. This is because it's within federal jurisdiction to provide the absolute minimum age, or the floor age below which no marriage would be valid. So that has not been provided in legislation federally. And therefore the common law applies. The common law is extremely old in this particular regard, and that's why, as the minister mentioned, there's some confusion. Generally, it's interpreted as age 14 for boys and age 12 for girls. There is older case law that does go much below that, but the general interpretation is age 14 for boys and age 12 for girls.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware of what the youngest age that we know of in Canada that something like that has taken place? I mean, you're referring to basically a common law, but have we got any actual cases that can come to your mind that you can explain to us?
Do you want to do that?
Yes, thank you. We have had some discussions with the provinces and territories about this issue, and they've consulted with their vital statistics to look at marriages that were registered in the provinces and territories and the ages over the past decade or so. There are marriages certainly under 16. There's 15-year-olds, and in the case of Saskatchewan, there were 2 marriages that were 14 that were registered. There were none registered below that age, but I mean, these are still fairly young for these times. And
I should just add that this minimum age is a capacity issue which travels with the child. So if the child is ordinarily resident in Canada or a Canadian citizen, then the age of the minimum age for marriage would apply regardless of where in the world the child is married. So there are also some anecdotal reports of Canadian children being married as young as 12 for girls and 14 for boys, none below that common law age in the last couple of decades.
Okay, good. In regards to dealing with these forced marriages, as you just said, there's been some confusion, I believe, in here about who would be charged. It says basic people that engage or are involved in a forced marriage, and some people think that even the guests at such a function would be subject to charges. I wonder if I could have that clarified so people clearly understand what we're referring to in that portion of the...
I can address this one.
Thank you. I'm going to get you, Joanne, one way or the other.
So the words that are included in the new offenses, the verbs, if you will, are celebrates, aids, and participates. And celebrates, in the context of marriage, refers to the formalities of the marriage itself. So in this particular context, someone who knowingly celebrates an early or forced marriage would be understood to be the actions of the official who's actually presiding over the ceremony itself. So that's a fairly limited class of individuals. In terms of aiding and participating, these are the types of words that are used in a variety of different criminal contexts. So this is not the first time that the criminal code would be using aids or participates in a certain type of conduct. For instance, there's an offense of aiding a person to commit suicide. So the person who commits suicide is not committing an offense, but one who aids them to do so is. Participation is also an action verb that is used in offenses related to terrorism and organized crime. So any person who participates in the activities of an organized crime group or a terrorist group is also committing an offense. And these are also long-standing principles of criminal law that a person who aids another person to commit an offense can also be found guilty of that offense.
Thank you, Ms. Kleinberg. Ms. Matheson has some questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. Yes, I usually do. I appreciate your expertise, and I'd like to go back to some of the questions I asked of the Minister, just to get a sense of what the department has been doing. The Minister said that there had been extensive teamwork in regard to the creation of this bill, and I want to know, based on that, and the fact that polygamy, for example, is addressed under the RRPA, to what extent did you find that there were polygamous families in Canada? Now, the Minister said that there were dozens, and I wondered how did you determine that, and did you come to some hard numbers in that regard?
Thank you for the question. So I believe the minister spoke to the fact that this is something that we have seen on an anecdotal basis. We don't have studies that give us, numbers of polygamists, but we have heard through consultations. So, for example, the minister held consultations over the summer. He had roundtables in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver on this subject, and he spoke to stakeholder organizations that work with victims of early and forced marriages. On the issue of polygamy, it was raised specifically, and there were stakeholders, and again, while they didn't give specific numbers, there were certain stakeholders who acknowledged that it is an issue and that it happens.
Okay, thank you. And I want to come back to the point about consequences, unintended consequences, in regard to a situation where polygamy is discovered and some of the family is deported. And the consequences for children who may be born here. What in your discussions did you hear from organizations or from groups in regard to the potential harm of deporting some of a family and leaving some here, or deporting all members of the family?
To my knowledge, that issue was not raised specifically. We certainly, it is an issue that has been raised by stakeholders in the legislative process. As our minister indicated, the framework of IRPA sets forward very, very specific inadmissibilities, and those inadmissibilities are very clear. However, our law also gives us a number of facilitative mechanisms that can be used on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, we do have the ability to use humanitarian and compassionate considerations. And humanitarian and compassionate considerations do consider, for example, best interests of the child. So those are situations that, as I said, would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Generally, officers look at the benefit of allowing someone to remain in Canada versus the risks of allowing them to remain in Canada.
Okay, and you're referring to already existing laws?
Correct.
Instead of S7. So
correct.
There are already existing laws that provide protection.
Certainly, and then and this is within the broader framework. So as I said, so the polygamy would be a new inadmissibility, but the other provisions that we already have in the Act would apply or could be applied on a case-by-case basis.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, one of the things that the minister referred to was help and support in regard to addressing those who are harmed unintentionally. And I'm wondering what has the consultations done by the various departments determined in regard to providing additional safe and affordable housing and investments in counseling and helping people, often very traumatized people, to navigate the system, particularly if they've been criminalized. Have there been discussions, and to what degree is the government planning to provide those supports and helps?
Thank you for the question. If I may, the Department of Justice has been looking at these issues for a number of years and has held 7 sector-specific round tables or workshops with police, Crown prosecutors, victim service workers, child protection workers, shelter workers, and academics to talk about some of the gaps, challenges, and some of the promising practices in dealing with this wide range of harmful cultural practices, if you will, or what the UN will sometimes call customary practices. And we've, as a result, also funded a number of projects. In 2013, we held a letter of intent for projects to respond specifically to forced marriage, which resulted in $500,000 over 3 years in funding for 4 projects, including for SALCO for awareness raising, training, and risk assessments. So some of the work of the key service providers we fund through that program. Status of Women Canada has also funded over $2.8 million for early and forced marriage and honor-based violence-related community-based projects. And they had a specific call for proposals in 2012, specifically on honor-related violence. So we cannot, at the federal level, directly fund some of the services, but we can fund NGOs and other community-based organizations that provide these services. And so this is something that we have been doing for a number of years and will continue to do.
Okay, thank you. And can you comment on the concrete realities? You talked about projects and proposals. Is there something concrete? Do we, for example, have new housing or housing that's been made available so that those who are unintentionally impacted can find safe housing?
Very briefly, we're running out of time. If you can.
Just in terms of housing, it's not something that our department would be in a position to fund constitutionally. We have an interdepartmental working group on early forced marriage and honor-related violence, as well as female genital mutilation and cutting, with 13 federal departments and agencies, and we have regular discussions about funding, looking for leveraging various funding opportunities throughout the federal government. And we've had discussions with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation about enhanced funding to shelters. Most of their money goes directly to the provinces and territories. So there are some challenges in the federal system to having funding the particular services you're mentioning. But we are outreaching with the provinces and territories directly to make them aware of the importance of these issues.
We have to move on. I'm sorry, Mr. McCallum.
Well, thank you. Just to return to my earlier point about the issue of the 5-year sentence, and that could include nonviolent crime like theft and mischief, I think. From a legal or technical point of view, would there be a way to amend that to limit the crimes to acts of violence? I think that was the intention, not to include these more minor crimes.
I mean, there's a way to draft many things. One of the main challenges, I think, would be in how the offenses one wanted to have captured would be identified. So they could either be identified through particular offenses being specifically listed, or they could be identified with a description, such as an offense that involves violence. Part of the problem with the use of the word violence is that it's not a word that really appears in offense provisions. So, for instance, the offense of assault is the application of force without the consent of the other person. So even the offense of assault is not described from a criminal law perspective in terms of violence. So one would have to think very carefully about the way to capture the sorts of offenses you wanted to see included to the exclusion of others. And difficulties, I think, would arise with certain offenses that people might reasonably disagree into which category they fall. So criminal harassment is a good example of an offense that certainly can cause a person to feel traumatized and fearful, but doesn't involve the physical application of force. Child pornography offenses, for instance. There's a way to look at them such that they are violent offenses, but there's another way to characterize them such that they aren't. So there's a characterization challenge.
Okay, thank you. A different question. In the House, the Revenue Minister said that the Justice Minister is working with his provincial counterparts on a framework to limit marriage for 16 and 17-year-olds to situations where a court has approved the union. So my question is whether the government could suspend the application of the 16 and 17-year-old marriage provisions until a provincial government had enacted rules as I just described.
Constitutionally, the federal government, the federal parliament, has jurisdiction only over, as I mentioned, that absolute floor minimum age below which there can be no marriages. So there really is no constitutional way to do that. The government would either have to set the age at 16 or set the age at 18, and in either instance there would be no marriages possible below it, but it's within provincial jurisdiction to deal with what happens above it up to the age of majority.
Thank you. And lastly, officials in the Senate hearings on S7 referred to an internal justice study on provocation. And I wondered if it might be possible for you to send a copy of that study to the committee.
Yes, that was, we looked at appellate cases from 1999 to 2014 that deal with some legal issue pertaining to the defense of provocation. We will have to confer with our departmental supervisors to see if we can provide it, and if we can, we certainly will.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Aspin.
Chair, and welcome again, officials, and thank you for giving us your advice on this important legislation. I want to focus on the barbaric practice of forced marriage, and a few questions, perhaps to Ms. Say. What information is known about the prevalence of forced and underground marriage in Canada?
Thank you. I will, if that's all right, respond. As the Minister had mentioned, these are certainly issues that are fairly clandestine and difficult to identify. So in terms of hard data, there's no actual category for forced or underage marriage at this point in time, and therefore there's no reliable statistical data in this regard. However, one of the most relied upon sources is the SALCO, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario's study, which identified 219 cases in Ontario between 2010 and 2012. The Department of Justice has also been looking at this issue for a number of years and funded 2 anecdotal studies on forced marriage in Canada to gauge the scope of the issue. The first was by Naima Bendris in association with Rights and Democracy, and it dates from 2008, and it examined the incidence of forced marriage in Montreal and Toronto through interviews with service providers. So the study did confirm the existence of forced marriages in Canada, that many women were unaware of their rights, and it did identify the link between forced marriage, honor-related violence, and polygamy. The second study was by Dr. Zora.
Okay, if I would mind, I've got a few questions, so
sure.
I'm limited in time.
Okay.
Do families typically take these forced marriages out of the country?
That's what I was just going to throw in as my cautionary note. Those studies do not distinguish between marriages that were celebrated in Canada and marriages that were celebrated outside of Canada. And certainly it would appear that a large number of them were celebrated outside of Canada. So yes, that's a concern. The other concern, of course, being that there were probably a number of telephone and proxy marriages that were involved as well, where one of the parties would have stayed in Canada and the other been in another country.
Okay, thank you very much. And that is a good segue into my next question of how will these proposed amendments prevent young girls who will be taken out of the country for the purpose of forced marriages?
Well, the amendments with the specific offences of underage and forced marriage ceremonies in the criminal code serve as anchoring offences for the extension of the offence on the removal of a child from Canada for the purposes that a criminal offence would be committed abroad, which currently applies to a number of sexual offences as well as female genital mutilation. So we're now able to extend that to removing a child from Canada for the purpose of an underage or forced marriage. It also allows for the linkage to the specific peace bonds, so that specific peace bonds could be taken out to prevent these marriages from occurring, including preventing the defendants from removing the child from the jurisdiction or from traveling or making arrangements for the marriage. So there are specific measures to prevent that.
Okay. Thank you. And what can you folks tell us about honor killings? Do you have any statistics or evidence in that regard?
Okay, yes. There's, as with forced marriage, there's no actual legal category of honor killing, and so we don't have any statistics or through Statistics Canada that would identify percentage of homicides that were actually related to honor. However, we have examined reported cases and identified around a dozen cases that appear to have been related to honor. Not all of these cases, of course, involve the defense of provocation. They were not always raised in all of those cases, for sure. But the commonality between these cases is that the defense, either the defense raises or the prosecution identifies the case as being related to the family honor as being one of the motives for the actual killing.
Okay. Of my time, Chair.
We got a couple of minutes.
Okay, and with regard to honor killings, with regard to the proposed legislation, and forced marriage as well, will there be some tracking with regard to this? Will there be tracking, monitoring, or tracking, or?
Well, again, in terms of tracking cases statistically, you need to have a particular category in the criminal code for the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey to identify it. So that's the police-based tracking system. It has to fall under a particular category. So once we have a particular offense, a specific offense of forced marriage, we would be able to track it. I just wanted to indicate, because I hadn't identified my notes until then, in terms of honor-related violence, since 1954, we've identified at least 20 people that have been convicted for first or second-degree murder in Canada, where there is some evidence on the record that it's related to family honor.
Okay. That seems to track with the information I have. There have been approximately 25 Canadian criminal cases of honor-based violence since 1995, with 21 of these crimes occurring within the last decade.
And because there isn't an actual category legally, and it's not a legal term, this will depend on your definition and how you are examining the case law. We took a fairly conservative approach to the case law, and it had to have actually had something on the record, either raised by the Crown, raised by the defense, or in the victim impact statements where the term family honor or shame was related directly to it. So it's fairly narrow, just to be on the safe side. But again, it's very subjective.
Thank you, Ms. Blackwell. Thank you, sir. Madame Blachette-Lamothe.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to return to something that was said earlier by Ms. Tsai. Ms. Tsai, is that correct? You talked about consultations that were held for the preparation of Bill S7. Was it possible for anyone who wanted to appear before these consultations? If not, how were invitations sent? How were people chosen for these roundtables?
Public, I believe that invitations were extended to stakeholder organizations that offer services related to early and forced marriages and polygamy.
Est-ce que tous ceux qui offraient de tels services ont...
Was everyone who offers those services invited?
J'ai vu les listes.
I saw the list. I imagine that about 20 representatives were invited to each meeting. So who was selecting those people? I can't answer that question. Okay, no problem. Was it public, or was the content of those meetings, the content of those discussions, is it accessible to the public? The results were not distributed. I don't know if we have the authority to distribute it. Thank you very much. I know you answer to the best of your capabilities. Just that at this committee, we had a study where witnesses were chosen by different political parties, and the content is public. And despite that, even though we saw that many witnesses recommended changes or abolishing conditional permanent residency, it wasn't taken into account. So I was wondering if the content of those meetings was really selected to advance a political agenda, or if everything was considered, but it's not for you to comment on that. Thank you for your answers. I have another question regarding what was done in other countries. I don't know who can answer at this table, but practices in other countries like Denmark or the United Kingdom, were those studied in the preparation of Bill S7? Yes, thank you. Regarding forced marriages, we examined what's done in a number of countries similar to Canada. And as you know, there are at least 10 countries in Europe that have introduced forced marriage offenses over the past decade. The majority have sentences of 2 to 7 years. So we looked at the United Kingdom, of course, Denmark, Sweden, Australia, France, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Australia, Austria, and Norway. And we looked at the results to date, and there are a number of countries where it's rather recent, so there haven't been proceedings yet. We've had information indicating that charges have been laid, that there have been arrests in Denmark. We don't know now what will come of that, but I'd like to indicate that the goal of criminal charges is not just the trial. It's really important to see that the law has an important social role to play. It sets the limits to behaviors that are acceptable or not in a society. So they draw the line, and you can't go over that line. So there's an impact in terms of deterrence. So victims can have the means. I have a question in that regard. Do you have studies that indicate that minimum sentences, for example, have a deterrent effect? There's no minimum sentence in this bill. Do you have studies that indicate that sentences like those in Bill S7 have a deterrent effect, have a preventative effect? You mean maximum sentences? Well, what's important is that sentences reflect the gravity. But do they have a deterrent effect? Do you have studies that indicate that?
The time's expired. Mr. Shorey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses also. I want to start with this because today also this conditional permanent resident provision is also, I mean, the opposition raise it all the time, and it seems like they are trying to give the message that abusive women in that kind of relation are fearful not to get out, and they are fearful that they may lose their status if they come out and report it. But of course, it is a very sensitive issue, and we are all the parties or all the members are united that we do not believe that there should be any family violence in those circumstances. So my question is that this is my understanding that some guidelines have been developed to assist officers in processing those kind of applications where they can they can go with exceptions based on abuse or neglect, and they can handle the sensitive information related to them. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, indeed, you are correct. So the department has developed guidelines to assist officers in processing requests for exemptions from the conditional permanent residence based on abuse or neglect, and also to assist in handling any sensitive information related to this case. So essentially, this allows spouses in abusive situations to come forward without fear of jeopardizing their permanent resident status in Canada.
Well, thank you for that clarification. I want to come back to Civil Marriage Act. I believe you will be responding to this. I want to talk about this free and enlightened consent provision, which will be added in Civil Marriage Act. I thought it is already there, but I'm surprised. But anyway, so the question is that when we add these words in Civil Marriage Act, how will this amendment assist the law enforcers? Number one. And number two, that how can this affect those who are forced into marriage?
Thank you for the question. Canada does not have, like some other countries, a single statute that codifies all of the federal aspects of marriage. Marriage, of course, being divided constitutionally between the federal parliament that has jurisdiction over legal capacity to marry or who can marry who, and the provinces and territories that have capacity over the solemnization of marriage, licensing and registration and other things like that. And so the Civil Marriage Act, when it was first passed, was passed for a particular purpose, and that was to provide equal access to civil marriage to same-sex partners. So over time, the Civil Marriage Act is becoming a codification of all of the federal aspects of marriage. So this would be to add two aspects which are currently only within the law for the province of Quebec. The statement that you must give free and enlightened consent, which exists in the common law, so it's very clear in the rest of Canada, but it's not in a statute anywhere that you can point to. So having it in a statute that you can point to, I think, will again make it somewhat easier, in the same way that, as I was just discussing with my colleagues, the UK experience has shown that having it in a statute in the United Kingdom that you can't force a child into marriage has given children something to say to their parents. Look, it's in the law. You can't do this to me. In the same way, this will provide that for children in Canada.
Well, thank you. You kind of covered my second question of peer countries, so thank you. I want to come back to you, Ms. Sai, because when we talk about early and forced marriage, I believe education is very important. And when someone chooses to come to Canada, I mean, they are given some literature, and I want you to share with us when we talk about this Welcome to Canada guide or Discover Canada. I mean, do they say anything about this barbaric practice or early and forced marriage, etc., to educate the newcomers?
Yes, so certainly both our Citizenship Study Guide, the Discover Canada publication, and the Orientation Guide, Welcome to Canada, have been updated to reflect the fact that Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to harmful cultural practices such as forced marriage or other forms of gender-based violence. We also have a wealth of information on the CIC website that it is available to newcomers to provide them general information on life in Canada, including information related to family violence, family law, and human rights.
Thank you. Mr. Leung. Thanks, Chair. Having heard our discussion mostly on forced marriage, child marriage, and other aspects of marriage, I would like to have some clarification on Canada's Civil Marriage Act as well as our common law Marriage Act. And where does it, number one, why did it take us so long to address this issue that the original age of consent was 7 years old? I mean, why is it taking us so long to bring this up to date? And my second question has to deal with one aspect of
the Marriage Act that perhaps is not addressed, or at least our discussion has not addressed it, is what about incestuous relationship? How far do we go to define what is an incestuous relationship?
All right. Well, those are very interesting questions. Why has it taken us this long to codify the law of marriage?
Yes.
I really don't know what the answer would be. I could speculate, but that's all I could do. I know that there was an agreement by the Government of Canada to codify this aspect of minimum age at the Uniform Law Conference of 1973. As soon as it was able to, given competing legislative priorities.
I don't think this topic's in the bill unless you're proposing an amendment.
No, there's no amendment. It's just for clarification that it's an interesting topic. Is incest?
Well, it may be interesting, but it has nothing to do with the bill.
Right. Okay, then. Well, then perhaps you can share with us why, what process have we gone through to bring our Marriage Act up to date to include these elements of forced marriage and so on. Like, what was it before to bring it up to date then?
As I was saying before, I think part of the reason for making the amendments now is that although these aspects are in the common law is not as easy to or as accessible for particularly for people who are not legally trained as a statute on the books. So the idea is to codify the three elements of the minimum age, the requirement for free and enlightened consent, and the requirement that all prior marriages have to be dissolved before you can marry. Not that any of these, except for the minimum age, are new, but just to make sure that it's all clearly on the books.
Now, we mentioned peace bonds earlier. How do what methods or what procedures there are for us to reach in to a family through a child that they have this protection to protect them with a peace bond in case there's a suspicion that they may be transported out of this country for marriage that does not want it.
Thank you. If a child is under the age of child protection in the jurisdiction where they reside, then the child protection authorities would become involved and stand in on behalf of the child for any act in terms of requesting a peace bond or any other intervention with the family to help them become aware of the harmful impact of forcing a child into a marriage. So normally that would be the role for the child protection. However, if the child child is over the age and speaks to a victim service worker, that person could apply for the peace bond on behalf of the child. Same as if the child contacts the police, usually it is the police that apply for peace bonds on their behalf.
So the agencies that would be responsible for this would be, say, social services or the police or other law enforcement agencies?
Exactly, normally, although anyone could do so on behalf of a victim if they felt that was necessary. They would.
I see. That's fine.
Okay,
thank you. Fine, thank you.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here this morning. It's been quite an informative session. I want to get back to the provocation defense, and you mentioned that there's been about 12 or 13 or a dozen cases where the prosecutor or the defense or the victim statement has mentioned that part. Would that be correct?
Yes, those would be cases that could be characterized as honor killings, but it wasn't in all of those cases that the defense of provocation was raised.
So how many cases use the provocation as a defense?
There were at least 3 cases let me just... the first one, all 3 of the cases went to their respective provincial courts of appeal on legal issues relating to the defense. The first case is Nahar out of British Columbia, which was decided by the Court of Appeal in 2004. In that case, it was the accused who brought evidence expert evidence from someone in his community. In this particular case, the accused was a member of the Sikh community, and he brought evidence before the court that the conduct of his wife, it was a case where he stabbed his wife to death, and he alleged that her provoking conduct was in the nature of defiant and disrespectful behavior. She was smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol, and having conversations and meetings with men not to his liking. So he raised...
I don't want to get into the details. So 3 cases where this was used. And in those 3 cases, did the judge in any ways, was the judgment influenced by the provocation defense?
Well, in all 3 cases, the defense was raised, but it failed.
Okay. So we don't have any case at all that has been successful using provocation in Canada?
No cases to date have been successful.
Okay. Okay, well, let's go to polygamy. So as I read the notes here and what the testimony I've heard, polygamy has been illegal in Canada for over 100 years. Would that be correct? Wonderful. And we haven't had any cases, successful cases, being tried over those 100 years. There is one case that's going through the courts right now. So with this new law, essentially we're creating 2 sets of rules, one for immigrants and one for the citizens. Would that be correct?
The criminal law with respect to everyone in Canada is exactly the same. The amendments in Bill S7 in no way affect the applicable criminal law that could apply. It's only a law in relation to the immigration context. So as a general matter, everyone who's in Canada is subject to being prosecuted under the same criminal offense. But I would let my colleagues from Immigration Canada speak to the immigration-related consequences of polygamy.
So I'm going to ask you a question. So why wouldn't we try those immigrants under our existing law? What is the need for this new law?
So the federal government creates laws, including the Criminal Code and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. But if I understand correctly, prosecution under the Criminal Code is the responsibility of the provinces. So in terms of the immigration law, yes, Joanne is absolutely right. The IRPA would only apply to foreign nationals and permanent residents.
I still don't understand why if we have a criminal law in place which is applies to everybody in Canada, what was the need to have this additional law enforcement through immigration? That's fine. Mr. Chair, do I have any questions?
Oh, I think Mr. Menegakis does.
Do I have a?
Oh, I'm sorry. You don't. You're out of time.
Great.
I'm sorry. I misinterpreted what you said. No, Mr. Menegakis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to our officials for appearing before us today. Perhaps I can add, as part of our response to some of the questioning we've heard today here, why this bill and why this bill now. I think we should highlight for all members to know that there have been approximately 25 Canadian criminal cases of honor-based violence, killings, and non-fatal crimes since 1995, with 21 of these crimes occurring within the last 10 years. 25 cases of this type of violence in the past 10 years, but on this side of the House, the government believes that one of this type of violence is too much. We did consult across the country, and we consulted with groups, organizations that are dealing with people every single day, dealing with this specific type of problem. And overwhelmingly, we heard the need for legislation to be put in place that will protect women and girls against such barbaric cultural practices. And I say that with a fair amount of emphasis and passion. It is cultural to some people that if their child of 14 years old does not abide by a decision they made the day that the child was born, that they should be somehow harmed, killed, stoned, discredited, thrown out, discarded. To them, it's a cultural practice. It doesn't speak to any specific community of people. We have a very dynamic, multicultural, and vibrant multicultural community in Canada. People that come from all parts of the world. We are speaking specifically about those that will perpetrate such barbaric acts on women, and particularly young women and girls. Clearly, our message is this, that we will not tolerate spousal abuse of any kind. Honor killings, gender-based violence, you name it. We're taking steps to strengthen our laws, to help to ensure that no young girl or woman in Canada becomes a victim of early or forced marriage, polygamy, so-called honor-based violence, or any form of harmful cultural practice. It's not the Canadian way. We don't do that in Canada. We need to have laws in place to ensure that these women, these girls, have a right to speak out and have a right to be protected. So my first question, having said that, I'd like you to comment on the peace bond process and how the peace bond will work.
Thank you. As the Minister did mention earlier, when you apply for a peace bond is a preventive court order, although it is in the criminal code. When you apply for one and a peace bond is taken out against a defendant, it does not constitute a criminal charge. That defendant would not have a criminal record. It is only if that defendant breaches the peace bond that they are subject to a criminal charge and potentially a criminal record. So it is a preventive measure, which is extremely useful where there are reasonable grounds to fear that an offense will be committed. And the general peace bond provisions, we examined those. They didn't seem sufficient enough to address this particular issue because it is extremely unusual to say we want somebody to stop making arrangements for a marriage. So it was really to focus on stopping those individuals from making the marriage take place, from basically pursuing the preparations and ensuring that the marriage ceremony takes place. So in order to focus on that, we had to focus on the specific ceremony itself. So having an offense based on the marriage ceremony, focus on the unique harm that is related to the marriage ceremony itself, which is basically a violation of that individual's human rights to be able to decide when and whom and whether they marry anybody, with all of the potential and almost inevitable violence that falls from that. So by focusing on that particular crystallization of harm, the peace bonds allow us to prevent that harm. And the experience in the UK with their forced marriage civil protection orders indicate that they're very effective in stopping families from forcing their children to marry, because most families are actually doing this because they believe it's in their child's best interest. And when they realize, one, that it's illegal and that it's harmful, and two, that if they do go ahead with this, they will have the shame of having committed a criminal offense, then that has a very strong dissuasive power. So this is sort of the Canadian equivalent at the federal level of the UK civil forced marriage protection orders, because in the Canadian context, civil protection orders would fall within the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories. So once the application is made, there's a number of conditions that can be issued against the defendant, including the requirements to surrender passport and other travel documents, limits on their movement from leaving the jurisdiction, etc.
So what are some of the penalties? So if someone has knowledge of this going on or assists in a barbaric act, now what are some of the things that we can do with the peace bond power to penalize those that would perpetrate or participate in such activity.
If if a peace bond is taken out against a defendant and the defendant breaches that peace bond, they are currently susceptible to a term of imprisonment of up to 2 years. This is will be changed with Bill, I think it's C-26, which would increase the maximum to 4 years in imprisonment. In terms of the actual, the new proposed offense of forced marriage, the maximum is 5 years imprisonment. Again, that is a maximum, and of course, it would depend on the discretion of the judiciary, depending on the particular circumstances of the case.
Thank you. How am I doing for time? I got a minute. Okay. Well, in the 2013 speech from the throne, we heard a little bit about this earlier. The government recognized that millions of women and girls worldwide continue to be brutalized by violence, including through inhumane practice of early and forced marriage. The proposed changes in this particular bill, S7, Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, will help ensure that these harmful cultural practices do not occur on Canadian soil. So, in my last 20 seconds that I have, I would strongly urge and implore all members of this committee to speak to their caucuses, to their leaders, to ensure that we expeditiously pass this legislation at the end of the day, because what we will be doing, Mr. Chair, is protecting women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meningakis, and I'd like to thank members from the Department of Justice and Immigration for visiting with us today and helping us start our hearings on this bill. Thank you very much for coming. This meeting is adjourned.